You can starve to death with a full stomach. Picture it. Deep winter, 20,000 years ago. You've done everything right. You've tracked, you've hunted, you've killed. There is meat in front of you, as much as you can eat, and you eat it, and you keep eating it for days. And you get weaker, not hungrier, weaker. There's a headache that won't go, a vague nausea, a tiredness that sleep doesn't touch. And if nothing changes, if all you have is that meat, and nothing else, this actually kills you, sitting beside a pile of food. Here's why. In winter, animals are lean. They've spent the autumn burning through their own fat reserves just to stay alive. So by January, a carcass is close to pure protein. And a human body cannot run on protein alone. Your liver can only convert so much of it into usable energy before it simply can't keep up. And everything downstream of that starts to fail. Arctic explorers rediscovered this the hard way, living on lean rabbit for weeks. And the name stuck, rabbit starvation. We assumed the problem with an Ice Age winter was the cold. It wasn't, really. The cold was solvable. The problem was that the food itself stopped being enough. The animals were skinny, the plants were gone, and the thing standing between a group of humans and death wasn't meat at all. It was fat. So when we ask what ancient humans did all winter, we're really asking a much sharper question. Not how did they keep warm? How did they get, store, and stretch enough fat to get from the first frost to the first green shoot, with everybody still alive at the end of it? The first thing to understand is that by the time winter arrives, it's already decided. Almost every choice that determines whether your group survives the next 5 months was made months earlier, in the warmth, when there was still time. How much fish did you dry? How many caches did you fill, and did you put them somewhere the wolverines can't reach? Is the shelter actually finished, or is it nearly finished? Were the clothes repaired in September, or is there a seam splitting right now, in the dark, at -30? Winter isn't really a season you survive. It's an audit. It's 5 months of finding out, slowly and unforgivingly, how good your decisions were in October. And that's a genuinely new pressure in the story of life on Earth. Most animals handle winter with their bodies. They migrate, they fatten, they hibernate, they grow a coat. Humans handle winter with foresight. We do it by imagining a future problem, months out, that isn't happening yet, and acting on it now, at real cost, while the sun is still shining, and every instinct says there's plenty. So what actually fills those 5 months? 4 things: getting fat, keeping fat, staying warm and lit, which costs fat, and filling an enormous number of empty hours. Go to almost any cold climate site from the Ice Age and look at the animal bone. The bones aren't just cracked. They're not simply snapped open for the marrow, which is what you'd expect. Marrow is fatty. Marrow is the obvious prize. They're smashed, pulverized. At some sites, the long bones have been reduced to hundreds and hundreds of tiny fragments, no bigger than a fingernail. Nobody does that by accident, and nobody does it to get at marrow. That's a deliberate industrial process, and here's what it was for. You smash the bone into fragments. You put the fragments in a container of water, a skin-lined pit, a hollowed log, whatever you have, and you heat it, usually by dropping fire-heated stones in, for hours. And as it boils, the grease inside the bone tissue itself melts out, floats to the surface, and cools into a layer you can skim off and store. Bone grease. Almost pure fat. Now think about what that costs. You have to gather the fuel. You have to heat the stones. You have to smash every bone by hand. You have to tend a boiling pit for hours in the freezing cold. And at the end of all that, from a huge pile of bone, you get a modest quantity of grease. People did it anyway, over and over, across continents, for thousands of years. That labor ratio is the single clearest signal we have of how desperate the winter fat problem really was. Nobody works that hard for a marginal return, unless the alternative is watching your family weaken on lean meat. When you see a pit of smashed bone, you're not looking at butchery waste. You're looking at somebody doing the arithmetic and deciding it was worth it. The second job is keeping what you've got. The obvious methods are drying and freezing, and in a cold climate, both are close to free. Dry fish and thin-sliced meat in the autumn wind, and you've turned something that rots in days into something that lasts months. Once the ground freezes, the whole landscape becomes a freezer. You cache food in stone-lined pits, weight the lid, and come back for it in February. But the most surprising method is the one we tend to think of as modern, or gourmet, or Scandinavian. They fermented. At a site in southern Sweden called Norge Sunansund, archaeologists found a long pit lined with pine bark and seal fat, packed with the remains of tens of thousands of fish. Not a rubbish dump. A deliberate, sealed, constructed container. And the contents show the fish were fermented, on purpose, around 9,000 years ago. And fermentation is the elegant answer to a problem I haven't mentioned yet. Fuel. Drying takes sun and wind. Smoking takes wood. And wood is a resource you're already burning to stay alive. Fermentation takes essentially nothing. You bury it, you seal it, you wait. And biology does the preservation for you for free. Now, one more thing about winter that almost nobody gets right. We picture deep midwinter as the hungry time. It usually wasn't. In midwinter, the stores are still full, the caches are frozen solid, and the animals, though lean, are at least findable against snow. The dangerous stretch is later, late winter into early spring. The weeks when the stores are running out, the caches are empty, the meat is at its very leanest, and the plants haven't come back yet. The frozen ground hasn't thawed, the roots aren't ready, nothing is fruiting, and there is still a month to go. That's the gap. Anthropologists call it the hunger gap, and it's a feature of seasonal life almost everywhere. The most dangerous part of winter is the part that happens after winter is technically over. Third job, don't freeze. And this is where the mammoths come in. On the open plains of what's now Eastern Europe, at a site called Megirich, people built houses out of mammoths. Not metaphorically. The structures are made from hundreds of mammoth bones, jaws stacked in interlocking rows to form the walls, tusks arched over the top as a frame, the whole thing covered with hides and earth. A single one of those dwellings used the bones of dozens of animals. They built them because there were no trees. On a cold, treeless steppe, the largest available construction material walking around the landscape is a mammoth. And when you can't build with wood, you build with what the land gives you, which was bone. And the same logic applies to burning. No trees means no firewood, and a fire is not optional at those temperatures. So they burned bone. Bone burns badly on its own, but burns hot and long when it's greasy and mixed with a little wood or dung. And the hearths at these sites are full of burnt bone fragments, fire, walls, and food, all coming out of the same animal. Then there's the other thing about winter that we, with our lit rooms, completely fail to feel: the dark. At high latitudes in midwinter, you might get 6 hours of weak daylight, or at the far north, none at all for weeks. That's not an inconvenience. It's most of your existence. And the answer was the lamp, a shallow stone dish, a wick of moss or juniper, and fuel that was, once again, animal fat. Hundreds of these have been found. The finest is a beautifully carved sandstone lamp from Lascaux, which burned while somebody painted a cave wall in total darkness. But notice what that means. Light cost fat. Warmth cost fat. Food was fat. Every single thing that kept you alive in winter was drawn from the same shrinking pool, and every hour of lamplight was an hour of calories you chose not to eat. Which raises the obvious question. If light was that expensive, what on earth was it being spent on? We imagine winter as dead time, endurance, huddling, waiting it out, hunched around a fire, counting days until it's over. It's almost the opposite. Winter is when things get made. Think about it from the inside. For most of the year, daylight is a resource you spend outdoors, hunting, foraging, moving, following animals, carrying water. There is no such thing as free time, because every hour of light is an hour you could be feeding somebody. Then winter arrives, and suddenly you are stuck in a confined space, with a group of people, for weeks, with the outdoors mostly closed to you. For the first time all year, you have hours. So that's when the work that isn't food gets done. Every tool that broke in the autumn gets repaired. New blades get napped. Cordage gets twisted, meter after meter of it, because next year's nets and snares and lashings all have to come from somewhere. Hides get scraped and worked and sewn into clothing for the following winter, which is itself a staggering number of hours with a bone needle. Carving, beadwork. And remember, we have burials with thousands of hand-drilled ivory beads, each one representing an hour or more of somebody's life. That labor had to come from a season when there was labor to spare. And it's not just objects, it's the transmission. Winter is when children are trapped in a shelter with the oldest people in the group. It is the teaching season by default. The stories, the genealogies, the songs, the maps held in memory, the knowledge of which plant does what. All of it gets passed on in the exact months when everyone is stuck indoors, in the dark, with nothing else to do. And this shows up in living traditions in a way that's hard to ignore. Across many cultures, in North America, in Northern Europe, in Siberia, certain stories are restricted to winter. You're not permitted to tell them at any other time of year. There's often a supernatural reason given, but the practical effect is unmistakable. The deep cultural material is bound to the season when there is time to tell it properly, and an audience with nowhere else to be. So the lamp is burning fat, and the fat is precious. And what it's being spent on is somebody making something, and somebody else telling a story. I don't think that's a footnote to the winter story. I think it might be the point of it. A huge amount of what we'd call human culture may exist because of a season that forced us to sit still, together, in one room, for months at a time, with our hands free. How does anyone know a site was occupied in winter? Bones don't come with dates. Actually, in a way, they do. Teeth grow in layers. In the cementum, the tissue anchoring a tooth in the jaw, animals lay down bands that vary with the seasons, thicker in the good months, thinner in the lean. Cut a thin section, look under a microscope, and you can see not just how old the animal was when it died, but what part of the year it was. One tooth from one deer, and you know the hunt happened in February. There's more. Fish have ear bones that grow in seasonal rings, like tiny tree trunks. Antler is shed on a fixed annual schedule, so whether it was cut from a living animal or picked up off the ground tells you the month. Migratory birds only exist in a place for part of the year, so their bones in a hearth pin the season down precisely. None of this is guesswork. We can look at a hearth 20,000 years cold and say, this fire burned in winter. That's how we know anyone was there at all. And winter wrote itself into the people too. When a child goes hungry or gets seriously ill, the growing tooth enamel briefly stops forming and leaves a line. Permanent, unfixable, still legible thousands of years later. Long bones do something similar, which means a hard winter isn't just an event that passed. It's a mark in a body, and the body keeps it. You can pick up a skeleton and count somebody's worst winters. So, what did ancient humans do all winter? They ate the fat they had rendered in October. They opened caches they had filled in September, wearing clothing they had sewn in August. They burned bone because there were no trees, and they burned fat to make light. And in that light, they made the things that the rest of the year left no time for. And they told the stories that were only allowed to be told when the ground was frozen. And they got through it, or didn't, on the strength of decisions made months before, when it was still warm, and there was still plenty, and nothing felt urgent at all. Nobody survived an Ice Age winter by being tough. Toughness is what you fall back on when the plan was wrong. They survived it by having been right in the autumn, by looking at a full landscape in September and being able to see February, and to act on a hardship that hadn't arrived yet. That's not a survival skill. That's imagination, used as a tool. And it might be the most human thing we ever learned to do.